Alright, so I have another discussion video today. It's going to be a little controversial, I guess. It's going to piss some people off, mainly PlayStation fanboys. I hate to say it. So let's give some background story before I go into this video. I have a history of being a big PlayStation fan. I grew up, my first consoles were the NES and N64. But I got a PS1 and PS2 used from my uncle when he upgraded to a new PS2, and I quickly fell in love with PlayStation. I loved the games on it a lot. I love the PS2 especially. It's probably, to this day, still my favorite console. The lineup on there is just absolutely perfect. And because of that, I ended up getting a PS3 instead of a 360, despite the fact that it was more expensive and all my friends were on the 360, because I loved PlayStation, and I loved the PlayStation exclusives and the games that PlayStation offered. And, I really wasn't going to make this video like today. I was actually going to include a big chunk of what I'm about to say in a review for God of War 2018 that I have planned. When God of War 2018 first came out, I had zero interest in the game. I didn't think it looked that good. I didn't like the changes to Kratos as a character, and I didn't like the changes to the gameplay mechanics that I had seen in the trailers. And I had since, once the game came out, watched a bunch of reviews and a bunch of gameplay videos, and I kind of formulated early on that I just wasn't going to enjoy God of War 2018 and avoided it. Some videos that helped make that decision were the review and rant by the Gaming Brit channel. I highly recommend going to watch his two videos because it'll kind of put a lot of what I'm going to say into perspective with how I look at games. And also a video called The Lost Identity of God of War, which really just showcases the changes in development perceptions and how the games were going to be with God of War 2018 compared to how they used to be on the PS2 and PS3. And a large part of what made God of War 2018 so different was its storytelling. A lot of people consider it more mature. A lot of people say it's different than the originals. And if you look at interviews from back then, even the way they talked about the game was they put the story first. They didn't talk a whole lot about the combat. They didn't talk a whole lot about the gameplay. And it was, hey, this story is going to make you feel. Look how mature Kratos has gotten, etc., etc. And while that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, it is a launching point for what the rest of this video is going to be talking about. And before I get into my take on PlayStation as a whole, I just want to say up front, I 100% understand and agree that video games are subjective. There are different types of games for different types of players, and everybody looks for different kinds of things in video games. Some people just care about graphics. They like to see how graphics have improved. They like to see how realistic they can get. Some people only care about the technical aspect of it. They want to push their games to the absolute limit, get the best frame rates, the best graphics cards. Some people care about speedrunning. I think speedrunning is really stupid and boring. But some people like watching speedrunners beat the game as fast as they possibly can, and some people even like breaking the game in their speedruns, which I also don't quite understand. Then there are people who care about the story in video games, and they just want to play games to enjoy a story. They think it's, more interactive or more fun than just watching a movie or reading a book, and for them, the story is the most important aspect. And of course, there's people like me who, the main thing I look for in a video game is gameplay. I like to be challenged, I like to explore gameplay mechanics, and I like to, play a game that is fun. And that isn't to say that I only care about gameplay. I do like some story-focused games and games, with stories. I like Kingdom Hearts a lot, and I care about that story. Warcraft 3's story. I like point-and-click games, and arguably you can say that those don't have the most engaging or crazy gameplay. It's just, in general, the gameplay is the thing that I tend to focus on the most when it comes to my opinions for them. And I'm not here to debate the quality of these games. I'm here to debate the creativity of these games as it pertains to a larger library. Many of these games are objectively good. They serve their purpose as intended. They're not buggy. They aren't weighed down by microtransactions or scummy business practices. They work, and there aren't frame dips and whatever. So, for all intents and purposes, these are quote unquote good games objectively. Subjectively, it's a little different, but I think by the end of this video you can see my point in saying that they aren't quite as creative as they used to be, especially as it pertains to a library as a whole for PlayStation and Sony. So let's take a look at, strictly keeping to first-party games, a roster of games from the PS2 and PS3 that Sony put out. You had Jak and Daxter, Ratchet & Clank, Sly Cooper, God of War, Heavenly Sword, Shadow of the Colossus, ATV Off-Road Fury, Gran Turismo, MotorStorm, Twisted Metal, Champions of Norath, Lair, Starhawk, Warhawk, Uncharted, SOCOM, Resistance, MAG, Killzone, PlayStation All-Stars, Infamous, Little Big Planet, Fat Princess, Patapon, Buzz, and, of course, the mentioned Last of Us. And the early roster for the PS4 was actually pretty diverse as well. We had Killzone Shadowfall, there was a Ratchet & Clank, Little Big Planet 3, Infamous Second Son and Infamous Last Light, we had Tearaway, and of course we had the Last of Us ports and Uncharted 4 on the horizon. The PS4 started off with promise and showed an early start of having just as much of a diverse lineup of games to rival that of the PS3 and PS2 to me. But in my opinion, that didn't really happen. And the roster of first-party games, as it looks now, is Uncharted 4 and Uncharted Lost Legacy, God of War 2018, Days Gone, Horizon Zero Dawn, Spider-Man, Death Stranding, and the upcoming Ghosts of Tsushima and Last of Us 2. And to me, all these games look the same. They feature realistic graphics and realistic settings. The gameplay is rooted in realism. And they're all the same basic genre, being third-person action games, with some slight changes here and there, like an open world or a crafting system. Props where it's due. At least Spider-Man featured an actual combat system with upgrades and combos, but I still felt like it was a little bogged down with the Mary Jane and Miles sections. And props again to Dreams, which came out recently, and that is, in my opinion, the most truly unique and creative game that PlayStation has put out in a while. But in general, I feel like the vast majority of their first-party games are very similar and samey. The diversity that we saw in the PS2 and PS3 is gone. Even games of similar genre back then had completely different storytelling methods, gameplay mechanics, and art directions. Ratchet & Clank didn't look or play at all like Sly Cooper, despite both being 3D platforming games. Killzone and Resistance didn't look or play like one another despite being first-person shooters. And God of War and Infamous didn't play or look like each other despite being action games. So, what happened? I truly think there are two things to blame for the changes seen in PlayStation. The first is the release and reception of The Last of Us. The game simply took the world by storm, and even though I think it's one of the most overrated and mediocre games of all time, many other people think that it's the best game ever, and it scored 10 out of 10s across the board from games journals. It made Sony a bunch of money, and it immediately got a remaster on the PS4 following its initial release on the PS3. I could totally see Sony being like, we want that, replicate that, as they were communicating with their other developers. I mean, the action game genre in general has slowed down, and storytelling in games has become more and more cinematic, but before, the only games really trying to pose, quote-unquote, as a movie was Metal Gear Solid. Now, pretty much all AAA games try to pose as movies, with scripted sequences, drawn-out walkie-talkie parts where characters expose exposition, and long cutscenes, coupled with cinematic camera angles and character perspectives. There's a bigger emphasis on stories when we talk about games now than gameplay. I mean, just today, a new Assassin's Creed was announced, and the trailer was a cinematic trailer, and the vast majority of articles are discussing setting and story, and not a whole lot is being said about gameplay. And part of that is I think we know what to expect from that type of game, but that's still the focus. The storytelling in Uncharted 4 was different from the storytelling in Uncharted 1 through 3. Sure, the first 3 focused on storytelling and on the characters, but the games were more about the adventure. They were really memorable because of it, and I really liked Uncharted 1 through 3. I remember going to El Dorado and Shambhala and exploring the Atlantis of the Sands in 1 through 3. They might have went into character backstories a bit, but the games were more focused about the adventure at hand, and the miscellaneous story elements were kept brief, and they were kept for the beginning or end of the game. Uncharted 4 had a very different feel to me. It was an okay game, but it's by far my least favorite of the mainline games. There was a lot of backstory explanation, a lot more that went into Drake's childhood, the sudden and random introduction of his brother, and the attempt to explain his real identity. They even ended the game with a time skip to him having a daughter, and all that felt very unnecessary to me, and I found myself caring a lot less for the story in Uncharted 4. A lot of the mystery and mysticism was gone, and I felt a lot of that was included to try and get some sort of emotional response out of the player to appeal to the Last of Us vibe. Oh, you liked the father-daughter relationship with Joel and Ellie? Well, Drake has a daughter now too. It was fucking dumb. And the supernatural elements from the first 3 games were non-existent in 4 well. They were trying way too hard to keep it grounded and rooted in realism. The most egregious thing to me was what they did to God of War 2018. They took a game that was built on being a fast, aggressive action game that was inspired by Devil May Cry with similar systems in place and turned it into a Last of Us-like game. The only thing people talk about with 2018 is how mature it is and how deep the story was. And they actually talk negatively about the old God of Wars because of that. They took a game that was like Devil May Cry and they slowed it down, adding drawn-out walking sections for Kratos to talk to his son and hunt deer in the woods. The blood and gore was toned down, the sex was gone, the combat systems were less interesting. You couldn't even jump. Then they made the camera more cinematic, shifting it to a third person, and again, it's fine if you like the game, it's fine if you like narrative-driven games, but to me, God of War was always Devil May Cry Light, and to turn it into The Last of Us in Norway with a Demon Souls light combat system just felt wrong to me, and turned me off from the game. And I say The Last of Us like because they introduced Kratos' son character to act as your companion. Again, appealing to that father-son dynamic from The Last of Us, or father-child dynamic from The Last of Us, and trying to get an emotional response from the player. And I think it's really stupid. I mean, personally, the father-daughter dynamic in the original God of War games between Kratos and Pandora was a lot better and more interesting than Kratos and Atreus. Compare Devil May Cry 5 with God of War 2018. Which game looks more fun? And which game looks like it has better combat? To me, the answer to both is Devil May Cry 5, and Devil May Cry 5 actually has a pretty engaging story as well. And I think that, as a whole, Devil May Cry 5 will have longer relevance in the industry, because once people stop caring about the story of God of War, they'll move on. But if people stop caring about the story of Devil May Cry 5, there's still the gameplay to come back to, because it's fast and engaging and skill-based and keeps you interested playthrough after playthrough. And we're seeing the same thing with The Last of Us 2 as we did with God of War that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. No discussion about The Last of Us 2 is about gameplay mechanics. I haven't seen a single article about the new zombies being introduced to the game. Remember the zombies? Yeah, The Last of Us is a zombie game, keep that in mind. Just story, 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 and how realistic it is. And that brings me to the second reason why I think Sony is starting to kind of suck. They're focusing way too much on politics. Now, politics do have a place in games. BioShock is a perfect example of a political game, but it presents its politics in a way that makes you think. It doesn't preach to you. And BioShock is still a fun and enjoyable game if you decide to ignore the political message as well. But let's talk about The Last of Us 2, which recently had some heavy cinematic leaks. Neil Druckmann, the director at Naughty Dog, has been described saying that The Last of Us 2 is not fun. Since the leaks, Naughty Dog has been copyright striking any video that remotely mentions The Last of Us or its leaks, whether they show the cutscenes or not. The leaks came from a group of anonymous employees who were frustrated and disgruntled with the way Naughty Dog was treating them. On top of the game crunch and the amount of work that they were putting into the game, a lot of employees felt like they were unable to speak their opinions and that they were being put down or blacklisted if they didn't agree with Neil Druckmann's political opinions. And people who have seen the leaks, I've read the leaks, I haven't actually watched the cutscenes myself, the plot for The Last of Us 2 is very politically driven. Now, Neil Druckmann is the newer director over at Naughty Dog. Before him was Amy Hennig. Amy Hennig wrote and directed games like the first 3 Uncharted's, as well as Uncharted Golden Abyss, Jak 3, and the Legacy of Kain series. Hennig has been on record saying that she loves the video game industry. She doesn't agree with the narrative that the industry is full of sexist men who put women down, and she actually has, she feels very comfortable with it and believes that men have helped her get to the position that she is. Neil Druckmann directly opposed those views, and eventually, because of it, Hennig left the company, and Druckmann became the new director over at Naughty Dog, and he immediately began putting his own political opinions into the games. And I think that's really ironic because, you know, his views actually pushed a very important and creative woman out of the Naughty Dog company. And The Last of Us 2 isn't the first time we're seeing Naughty Dog's and Sony's politics pop up. If you remember, back when Uncharted 4 came out, they got rid of Donut Drake, a long-standing joke skin in the Uncharted series, to avoid offending people. We've seen female character designs heavily toned down to avoid being too sexy, like Chloe in The Lost Legacy, or even Mary Jane, Silver Sable, and Black Cat in Spider-Man. And one reason I think that specifically with Spider-Man I say that those characters are toned down is because look at Spider-Man himself and all of the villains. They all look crazy and flashy and over the top and comic booky. Then in comparison, Mary Jane and Black Cat and Silver Sable just look very muted and boring. I wish that they would have also had an equal flair to them. Sony has taken a hard stance and begun censoring and denying certain Japanese games from being published because anime titties are bad. And Nintendo, of all companies, is allowing these games to be released uncensored. Who would have thought that Nintendo would become the bad boy instead of Sony? Remember the old Crash Bandicoot ads? Remember how Sony was always considered the edgy one? And now we're seeing it come to a head with The Last of Us 2, a game riddled with personal political opinion, featuring a politically charged plot made by a dev that has been mistreating his employees and making them fearful for having their own political opinion, to the point where the game was leaked. And many fans aren't happy with the leaked story and cutscenes. Many people think that the story is bad, and this isn't just this sounds bad. The actual cutscenes have been leaked. People have seen the actual story. People can see the actual game as it is going to be released. And many people aren't happy with the political focus. And many people have said that they're not going to buy the game now because of that. When the story is the main selling point of your game, and people aren't willing to buy your game now because they don't like that story, that's a big problem. And when you strip that story out, The Last of Us really isn't that fun of a game. You aren't left with a game with engaging gameplay. You aren't left with a game that you want to keep coming back to despite the story. You're left with something that's hollow and almost sterile in today's gaming landscape. And I feel that way with a lot of AAA action games right now. You take out the story of Devil May Cry or Doom Eternal and you still have a fun game that keeps people coming back over and over and over. If you take the story out of something like The Last of Us or God of War 2018, you're left with a game with slow walking mechanics, with occasional action set pieces, and not the best combat. And Sony will start to find itself without fans if they continue releasing politically charged games with bad stories and bad gameplay. Then, you even lose those gamers who are story-focused and PlayStation diehards. The scary thing about all of this, to me, is that people who legitimately just don't like The Last of Us 2 will be called bigots. The whole "you don't like the game because you're a bigot" argument is not a legitimate excuse for a bad game. A game should be evaluated on its own merits and quality, not its politics behind the scene. I hope the higher-ups at PlayStation realize that sooner rather than later, or they will find themselves with a lot of extra PS5s in the coming years. So, let me know what you think. Am I crazy? Am I being unfair? Or do you think that my opinion kind of has some basis and Sony is lacking in creativity lately? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. Maybe I need to give these games a second chance, or maybe they're not for me. I don't know.
Hi, Sugar Plum. You new here? Well, what you got that's, hot? And, wait, I've seen you before. You're with the Underground.
Shh! I'm Tess. Torn sent me to spy on Crew. Play along, and I may be able to get my hands on a few of Crew's secrets.
Ooh, I love undercover work, baby. But, two can work better than one. Let me help you out. Wow, there sure are a lot of bottles back here. Woo! Ooh, that goes down, ooh, boy. Gee, I suppose that's real gold floating in there? How about this purple stuff? Whoa!
Jack.
That's the stuff.
I need you and that talking rat to go around and make a few collections for me.
Hey there, Five Gins. How's crimes?
What's his problem, eh?
Nothing. I'm just fine. Mind your own business. I sometimes feel so very,
Listen,
very
I have 6 clients around town who are about to make money drops for me. I need you to collect each money bag as fast as you can. And take care of any guards who get curious.
How
Get to a money bag too late, then some town
so dry. You know what's the trouble with you, Crow? You got no vision. This place could be a real swinging joint. Hot heaven with more dancing, more macking, more women. Jack knows what I'm talking about.
14 money bags before they disappear and bring them back here. If you lose even one bag,
love you,
then
man.
don't come back, eh?